Hi, Alexia. Welcome to the CDR Policy Scoop. So happy to have you back here.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to see you both. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year as well.
Yeah. So we thought, what about checking in and having a conversation around what is happening on the governance side of carbon markets? There's a lot happening on the VCM front, but not only. And also possibly, dissecting what it means for removals and just looking at all the different initiatives and how to make sense of it. So broad brush, but I'm sure we'll end up digging into some interesting aspects here.
Yeah.
So you've been heavily involved with the ICVCM, obviously. I've been involved recently in the SBTi work myself. And I'm looking at all these different developments, and then I'm looking at all kinds of other initiatives coming up. And like, if anyone was trying to make sense of like what to pay attention to and what is noise, like what is the general guidance from you, Alexia?
Yeah, it's a great question and great to be here. And also before we start, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge what's happening in my country right now. We're going through enormous turmoil and governance challenges ourselves. And I know you guys have a broad international audience. And I just want to assure everyone, because I hear that it doesn't make the international news all the time, that people are organized, they are peacefully resisting, they are not taking any of this laying down. And so we are fighting fascism in all of its forms with everything we have on the ground here. And we are not going down without a fight. So I just want to send that reassurance, because we see it every day, everywhere. And what's happening in my country is appalling and horrifying. And I know the world is watching with great trepidation. We're going to get through this. So with that, back to our favorite regularly scheduled content around carbon markets, because I think, this sort of, speaking of a market that's been through its own twists and turns over the last 15 years, 20 years, the carbon market is certainly that. And if it's your point, there is a huge amount of noise. I think there might even be more noise than there was, even just last year with some of the new entrance to the greenhouse gas accounting and carbon measurement space. And I generally am feeling like there is a path forward. I'm feeling much more optimistic than I was even just a couple of years ago. I think people are getting a lot clearer about what it is that we need these systems to do. And I think starting to recognize that there needs to be a comprehensive approach. And so, the way I think about the market and kind of segment the various pieces of it is you've got your supply side sets of rules and regulations. And so that's everything from the standards themselves, the ICVCM as a meta standard, emerging international rules coming out of the UNFCCC around Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, so both 6.2 and 6.4, and then all of the kind of domestic regulations that are in place for cap and trade and carbon markets and offset credit generation that are in various stages of maturity and promulgation. That's sort of one big piece. And there is a lot happening right there. I think the moral of that story is really increasing convergence over time, but also still a significant amount of balkanization and fragmentation. We're still seeing lots and lots of new standards setting different rules, but the market's come a really long way around consolidation on kind of a fewer set of methodologies that are then informing and moving more fluidly from the voluntary space to the compliance space. So one of the things that we've seen happen in the last little bit is we've seen more and more countries come to the ICVCM and say, hey, help us understand, how some of these emerging frameworks that we're considering benchmark against the core carbon principles and think about, okay, how do we actually become that truly global threshold for quality across the board, recognizing that there's always going to need to be geographic and country-specific pieces that are implemented on the supply side. So that's kind of the supply side. I don't know if either of you have anything to add on that.
Yeah. Because and then we'll definitely move to the buyer side as well.
Yeah.
On the supply side, There's a lot to unpack there, because what I see is, even in my conversations with governments, for example, in Europe, for example, now the CSEF is, going to be published, I think, this week, the first 3 methodologies, right? So there is kind of a reference framework that has been developed over several years. And now my situation is I'm talking to national governments and that want to implement their own, in this case, carbon removal policies, and they need a reference standard, right?
Yeah.
And now they're asking, should we use the CSCF? But it's limited. We hear criticism about it. Should we develop our own? Should we go to ICVCM? So what would you recommend today to a government that wants to allocate funding, say, this year, next year, and is looking at this fairly confusing ecosystem?
Around CDR specifically, or markets more broadly?
I guess CDR is the main topic of this podcast. So I guess, if you could limit it maybe to that.
Yeah. So we've now, in fact, I just did a tally the other day, and I think the ICVCM has approved like a dozen CDR specific methodologies to date. And we can share that list of what those are. And so that is a good starting place for kind of where the international consensus is around what benchmark best practice looks like for methodologies related to various types of CDR, right? Both engineered and nature-based. So I think that we do know, and there's a few places where we have pretty strong international consensus and convergence around what right looks like. Obviously, I think there's a need. I see a real need to bring into all of these decision-making processes some of the newer expertise around CDR that's come into this space in the last 5 years. Many folks tend to be earlier in their career, or they're newer to these markets, and so they aren't automatically included in the conversation in the way that people who've been in the markets for a long time are. But they bring unique perspective and frankly, knowledge sets to the table around the state of novel CDR technologies, because, as you know, things are moving so incredibly quickly in the CDR field, and there is so much iterative learning, experimentation, and kind of evolution of our understanding about what's working, what doesn't work, where we need further scientific research, where we actually feel like we're getting close to, kind of being carbon credit ready. And I'm really hopeful that we can move the field towards a more formal and structured process for understanding like when various types of technologies really are ready for crediting prime time, and when we actually need to say, no, we really need further R&D. Because we saw this in the early days of, carbon market 1.0 or whatever you want to call it, where there was a bunch of stuff that people were like, this seems like kind of an interesting idea. There's no other way to pay for it besides the carbon markets. And so we're just going to shove it all into the carbon markets and issue credits, regardless of how confident we are in the legitimacy or efficacy of those credits. And I think that's a real disaster for the market personally, because what you end up with then is the New York Times expose or the scandal, in 3 or 4 years that was like, oh, actually, this thing didn't deliver any of the environmental benefit that they sold. And so one of the things that we've been doing a bunch of thinking about is, how do we think about those early stage methodologies and make sure that they are really ready for crediting prime time prior to being issued actual emission removal credit.
To explore it from now a slightly different angle, and Sebastian, I might be kind of breaking the pattern you had in mind for the session, but it's something that keeps coming up in different conversations, and I thought it would be clear to bring some clarity here. Is if we look at how, especially on the voluntary market sides, the governance is evolving and the guidance is evolving, it looks like we're building a lot for contribution claims. That seems to be kind of like VCMI is driven by that. ICVCM is kind of neutral, but still, I would say, sees that. I feel like we're building for something that like 5 years from now, that should be the thing. But in practice today, what drives the voluntary market is whatever we call it, offsetting, compensation, neutralization, but like the offsetting claims. And obviously the removals market is also largely relying on this. So how do you see where we are and where we're going when it comes to this?
I don't know if you've heard me rant about contribution claims. um, but
I haven't. I mean, my take is like everyone talks about them, but no one is really seeing them.
Yeah.
So, like, what's your take?
My take is that they aren't going to work. I just don't think we have had a very limited track record of success in sort of saying, we should do the right thing because it's the right thing and just go out and like spend some money on some stuff. And in conversations with the folks who were kind of early proponents of the contribution idea, and look, if we lived in a different world, I love the idea of contributions. It's so nice, right? But we don't. We live in a world that's driven by decision makers who are trying to optimize around a set of core objectives. And so that, when I talk to people about a contribution claim, I'm like, first of all, there's no real specificity around how much money you're spending. And SBTi's latest version of like put a price on carbon and then spend the money on good stuff is a way to approach it. I don't think it's going to be particularly successful personally. And I think it's a really bad outcome for the environment. And here's why. If you say, okay, set aside, $1 million and spend it on good stuff for climate change, because that's what this is about, right? Right now, under a contribution claim, you can just like write a check to whoever you want. And there's no monitoring or verification about what happens with that money necessarily. There's no reporting on the outcomes of what you spent that money on. And if I'm a decision maker and I'm deciding where to spend $1 million, I want to make sure that, what I'm spending my money on is actually having a material impact on the problem I'm trying to solve, which is climate change. And so you probably want to make sure that you're not funding something that somebody else was already going to do anyways, e.g. additionality. And you probably want to measure the impact of the thing that you're funding so that you can determine whether or not it's really having an impact. Measurement and baselines. So you just end up back at the carbon market if you actually care about a system that gives you accountability, visibility, and transparency into what you're spending your money on. And so I think part of what's been, just speaking frankly, as you know I do, really frustrating for me in this last 5 years of conversations is that we're just reinventing what is functionally already in existence in the carbon market with new words and new approaches because people have decided that the old system is not worth trying to save or fix or leverage. And that, it's cost us a huge amount of time. It's cost us a huge amount of money. It's cost us a huge amount of political capital. And most importantly, it's cost us a huge amount of missed opportunity in driving near-term, real-time emissions abatement. And that's what upsets me so much about where we are in this conversation today. Because to your point, we need to spend the money now.
I'm with you on this, but I do feel like parts of the carbon markets lives in a different reality, and I hope
think
they will come
especially in Europe. My sense is that because so much of the contribution conversation is being driven by European-based NGOs and the conversation around standard setting. And this has also been part of my frustration here is that, companies in the U.S. Today especially, but even under the Biden administration, we're just operating under a wildly different set of social norms and expectations than companies in Europe, where, the entire European economy is regulated to decarbonize. Everybody is participating and touched by a price on carbon in some way in Europe, in a way that is emphatically and dramatically not the case in most of the rest of the world. And even if they do have a price on carbon in places in the rest of the world, that price is generally quite low. And so that I think really presents a challenge for those folks who are trying to design global, internationally relevant and applicable standards. But I think it's one of the reasons why what SBTi is building is going to be useful really only for the richest, most dedicated, and most committed companies that are willing to pay a green premium kind of across the board for things. And whether that gets characterized as a contribution or an actual compensation or offset, I don't know at the end of the day. And frankly, I don't even really care as long as it actually drives real money being spent in real time on things that matter. And we have a system for measuring the impact of what we're spending our money on.
Can I ask, what should the SBTi do instead? If you had a magic wand?
I actually wrote a blog about this 3 years ago. I really actually think that we are going to need to move to something that is dramatically simpler than what we are designing for today. And, I just want to be really clear. optimizing for supply chain decarbonization is very important, right? Like, we need to be pushing companies to do the hard, expensive work to leverage their purchasing power, their contracts, their influence to help push emissions abatement throughout their supply chains. And like, I'm on the governing board of the AIM platform. We've just spent the last 3 years writing a standard and rule book, which will be released in March, around how you do supply chain tied intervention accounting in a credible and transparent way, because actually very little of that existed prior to us kind of getting that effort off the ground a number of years ago. And so, we're getting those rules in place. But I think the challenge is that because we're so focused on making sure that every ton in your supply chain is addressed with a ton that looks exactly like the ton that's in your supply chain, right? We're creating a situation where we're making it incredibly expensive, very difficult to engage, and extremely difficult to execute for companies to do that level of granular matching, especially where you're putting really draconian restrictions on market-based accounting approaches. Because if you have a scope 3 emissions, you, by definition, do not control those emission sources. They are not your emissions. They are your customers. They are your suppliers. They are buried deep in your supply chain. Most companies do spend-based emissions accounting for their scope 3. Right? Which means that they literally have these huge, mushy categories of things that they spend money on, like purchased goods and services. That's computers, paper, trucks. Literally everything that you buy gets lumped into this one category. You say how much you spend, and then you assign an average emissions factor to it. So my suggestion, and I think where we're going to end up, say 5 years from now, is that people are going to be like, oh my gosh, this system is way too complicated. We need a ledger for responsibility. We need a ledger for what companies are doing. And that just needs to be the thing. And we want transparency and insight into, are you actually doing anything, and is it moving the needle on global climate change? And show us what you're doing in a clear and transparent way. And I hope we can get there sooner rather than later and keep the best of kind of this incredibly complicated system we're building, because there's a lot of good in there. I think there's a lot of really useful insight into systems and tools we're building. But if we say that's the only way, then the CDR market isn't going to make it. Most of the tropical forests in the world aren't going to make it. We're just not going to have the pathways to purchasing and investing in those system-wide mitigation interventions and transformation efforts that we know are fundamentally important to solving this problem. So I don't know if you guys agree with that or not. It's a pretty unorthodox view, I think, given kind of where the conversation is today. But working with the non-experts in the companies, Eva, to your point, like, I think we need to start sort of being like, hey guys, this is getting a little out of hand. Can we take a step back and really think about what the big picture is and what we're trying to get done here, really, for the environment and for climate change mitigation?
Yeah, a lot of complexity.
But how do we move from where we're now to that?
I think we
Because,
just say,
SBTi
we just say
is,
enough.
but who says enough?
Like the buyers. So the people who are actually purchasing, the folks
but they can
kind
just
of
leave
in
the
the middle.
SBTi, right? Like they basically,
And they
either it
have
works for them
in
or they
droves.
exactly.
Yeah.
So,
It's just, the finance sector, the electricity sector, oil and gas, most heavy industry have all been totally disenfranchised from that process. So
but they've left without saying, but we want this instead, right? Like, so this is what I'm saying is they
well,
either they stay or they leave, but without saying anything and not necessarily signing up to something else.
that's right. And that's that I think is our biggest liability and challenge at this point, right? Is that I think that we personally, I think the environmental community has failed in our governance obligations to the voluntary space in many respects on the demand side. I actually think we're doing a pretty good job on the supply side. There's a ton more that needs to be done, but on the demand side, like, we are not creating a set of rules that both meet a high environmental integrity bar and solve the problem we're trying to collectively solve and work in the real world. And those are the three things that, like, are sort of my non-negotiables, right? It has to solve the problem we're trying to solve. And I think part of the challenge is that, there's a real almost tribal belief that's emerged now in this space that, what is tied to your inventory are real emissions and are sort of sacrosanct. And everything that's outside of your inventory is greenwashing garbage. And if you actually engage in greenhouse gas accounting for real, it's very obvious and evident that is actually really couldn't be further from the truth. And Sebastian, you wanted to tie into this conversation around consequential and attributional accounting. There's two sets of things that people are getting really confused about. The idea that attributional accounting is the correct or best or right form and a real representation of emissions, and that impact accounting is made up garbage because you have to do it relative to something else. And we're seeing a huge conflation of inventory accounting and what it takes to sort of get that static emissions source together, and intervention accounting and what it actually takes to change things in the real world. And under Paris, right, those are two very separate systems. They talk to each other, but they are not the same. And so SBTi is the first standard ever to attempt to do all target setting tracking only with the inventory, right? So they're just saying that if it's not showing up in your inventory, then it's not a legitimate reduction. And the problem with that approach is that it actually leads to a system that is less transparent, less credible, and less visible and rigorous, because we've just got everybody now trying to turn what should be transparently accounted for interventions that you think about using impact accounting, right? I made an intervention in the world. My emissions were A. Now they're B. We're measuring that difference. We're having it verified, and we're reporting it through either certificates or other kind of public and transparent systems. That the fact that we're saying this whole piece of the equation is no longer good means that if you're actually trying to, as a company, make emission reductions in your supply chain, you have to do all of these crazy gyrations to try and say, okay, our emissions profile was this, now it's this, and so we're going to use this and shove it into our inventory over here, but it doesn't quite match, and so we only get credit for 5 instead of the 10 that we paid for, and so where does the other 10 go, and how do I get credit for that? And it's just creating a lot of what I'm observing are kind of perverse outcomes when it comes to thinking about investing at scale, investing for efficiency, and investing in all of the places where the IPCC is really telling us we need to be focusing between now and 2030. What it is doing is creating a lot of jobs for consultants, right? Because in order to do this level of accounting, you need a small army, truly. The big tech companies have sustainability teams of 200 people, right? And a lot of those people spend their time doing data collection, analysis, measurement, trying to structure deals in a way now that look like attributional accounting when they really should be impact accounting. And that it's adding to your point earlier about all the noise. It's really just adding confusion and noise, because we now have the CEO of Exxon weighing in about greenhouse gas accounting approaches. Right? I never thought I would live to see the day where you have CEOs of major companies coming in and saying, what is happening and why is this system so broken? And that is such a liability for us. It is a huge, because what happens is we're going to lose our social license to regulate, right? We all just kind of said, hey, we're the voluntary market and we're going to stand up and we're going to regulate this space because no one else is. That's the way the carbon market has operated on a voluntary basis since the beginning, right? Because governments mostly just weren't paying attention, except in a few notable instances like the EU. And even then, right? And so I think we have I personally see a crisis for us coming, which is that, we've tried really hard to create a super complicated, very granular, beautifully designed system that drives funding into supply chain decarbonization. And I think we're pretty close to that, honestly. I think there's a rule set. It's hard to implement. It's expensive, but it's doable. And I want to acknowledge it's driving real impact in hard to abate sectors and places where people are just not going to spend the $200 or $300 or $400 a ton that it's going to take to get the green product in instead of the fossil-based incumbent. But even there, we still, without flexibility, are just going to be bumping up against a variety of constraints around deliverability, around, whether or not there's a product that matches exactly that piece, that subcomponent in your inventory, whether or not you can find the right kind of calculations to do, whether or not there's any transparency around those calculations. So, I think that I think that SBTi still has a long way to go to design a standard, a functional standard that really actually drives money where it's most impactful. And what we had said to them originally was like, look, do what every other target setting system in the world has done and have companies set a target, give them flexibility about how they meet their target. I would love to see, I don't know, deliver 75, 50, pick a number % of that from stuff using this like very granular supply chain matching requirement so that we can keep driving the money into internal decarbonization. And then let them make up the difference with other stuff that we know is also verified and credible and vitally important for stabilizing the climate, like CDR, like investment in tropical forests, like investment in new renewable sources that don't touch a supply chain, which is a huge problem, right, that we're trying to solve for in this current construct. And all of those things, like we need all of those things and we need money to be flowing into all of them. And really, we just need to sort of come up with something that folks are comfortable with that says, here's how much you use where and go to town. Like they could have solved this problem so easily. And, I mean,
It's
it
easy to
really,
say.
it's been unnecessarily complicated in my opinion.
Yeah. So, Sebastian, was there something else you wanted to bring in? We have 3 minutes to go. I have one general question I still want to explore. Yeah. So, as we started out looking at the governance and the noise, and I think you already well articulated how there is a lot happening on the supply side or regulating that, but there is yet plenty to be done on getting demand out there. If you look at the carbon markets governance in general and all these different initiatives, and there are many overlapping initiatives, do you still see any specific gaps as well? Because I mean, we keep seeing new initiatives coming up in like every single year, which means that there are still gaps. Like, where are still the gaps where we will see that something coming would be great?
I think there's two places I see a big gap. One is just in resolving this question around how do you build a credible demand side governance structure that actually works, as we've been discussing at length. The other big gap is what I call kind of the missing middle of the connective tissue of the market, right? So there's a lot of work that needs to happen this year and next around just the fundamental sort of pieces of the market that are going to need to be in place in order to move it out of its awkward adolescence and into full-fledged functional adulthood. And those are things like standardized legal contracts, interoperable registries, a universal data model so that we can actually compare and track credits as they're moving around the globe, pricing transparency. There's just some really fundamental parts of this market that are not done yet. And if we're serious about getting to scale and we're serious about crowding in institutional capital, we have to address that missing middle. And we have to do it in the next 2 years because all of those systems are now being built for Article 6 implementation around the globe. And so there's a lot of work to do, I see, in the next couple of years is just like actually getting that kind of connective tissue of the market so that we can have a truly global, interoperable, regulated and compliance market that is existing in harmony and in ways that are complementary and not contradictory, so that we can leverage every single penny we can unlock, and we can move fast and transparently and at scale. So those are the big gaps that I'm seeing right now. Are you guys seeing anything else major that I'm missing?
I mean, very well laid out. Anything, Sebastian?
I think, Alexia, you've got your work cut out for yourself for the
Yeah.
next 2 years then. Because if you're not going to do it, I don't think anyone can.
Yeah, we are setting expectations here, and it's all on record. So
just these small problems,
just those few little bits that I'm missing, right?
Small little things.
Alexia, thank you as always. When we have a great guest on the show, 30 minutes are never enough, and we could have spoken 2 hours. We just got started, but I think there was a lot of really interesting stuff in there. So thanks for joining us again. And a lot of food for thought, I'm sure. And we'll have you back on to talk about how we're progressing on these fronts.
That sounds great. Join the VCM Plus Coalition, because that is the place, Sebastian, where we're bringing the market together to work, because we certainly can't do it alone. And it is going to be an all hands on deck movement. So I'll send through info on that. And really appreciate you guys having me. And great conversation as always.
Thanks.
Bye, Alexia.
Thanks.
Bye, Evan.
Bye.